It is my mission to collect all of the video games in America. It has come to my attention, however, that despite missing some of the greatest years in gaming history, due to being unborn, games were not always good. Now, I pride myself on my ability to objectively review games. The distinction between the quality of the game and whether or not you like it is one that everyone should know really well. With that in mind, I really hate old games, and I think that they're really bad. Obviously, the description of old video games is pretty vague, so allow me to define what I consider to be an old video game. For the purposes of this video, an old video game is one that is bad because of its age. Please keep in mind that not all literal old video games are bad, and rarely are video games bad just because they're old. Although in this case, they are. And that is due in no small part to the limitations of hardware that game developers had to deal with back in the day. The first console with interchangeable cartridges is a statement that has a million asterisks, but I'm sure we can all agree that the Atari 2600 was the first console that really connected with the consumers at the time, and was the most popular console to come out of the 70s. Wow, that's old. So old, in fact, that the hardware they were working with measured the random access memory it had using bytes. I hate the Atari 2600 and the games that are on it, because I struggle to really call any of these games. Games are supposed to be fun, and I'm not having any of it. If in my collection there was this console, I don't think I would boot up a single one of these cartridges, because what is even the point? I'd get bored after 5 minutes, and you would too. Don't even pretend you wouldn't. So why bother? The hardware was so limited, the game often couldn't explain what you were supposed to do, so you had to read the manual. But you often don't find complete in-box Atari games with the manual for the price that I would pay for each one, that being 99 cents. This reading the manual nonsense would continue for the next 2 generations of consoles or so, but really it was most present here. The game file sizes are so small that third parties could cram 1,000 of these on a cartridge and sell it for $10, so then maybe I should pay 1 cent per game. Okay, now on to real video games. In the next generation, we have the classic, the legendary Nintendo Entertainment System. The importance of this console to the gaming industry is impossible to overstate. It single-handedly saved the North American video game industry, and real games could at least be found in this console generation, but there's definitely a quality curve. Comparing the quality of Super Mario Bros. 1 to 3 is interesting. No, we won't talk about 2. That's like taking vanilla ice cream and putting rat poison in it. What was that? Now that the console of the day has more memory in it than an empty Google Doc, there's potential for these games to be complex and also evolve within the same generation. Mario 1 is a solid game, the earliest version of a platformer, and therefore very basic. Mario 3 is very fun, and the sprites are way more appealing, the platforming more complex, and far less arcade-era relics left in the game. This game is so good that I might actually buy this game, even today. That is, if it weren't being sold by retro sellers for $50. I could buy 5 of the most important titles to video gaming on the PS3 for that much. And there is so much more to each of those games, even on the individual level. What do you think you're getting away with, retro video game stores? This is really more emblematic of greedy retro game stores and their ridiculous prices, but the fact that it's so expensive and no longer purchasable on the NES Virtual Console, for $5 by the way, it makes me hate it even more. But Grayson, I'm sure you're thinking, what about the rest of the games on the NES? I'm sure there were good ones among those. No, there were not! Just take a look at some of those good games. The scope of some of the other NES games is really impressive, especially for the time, coming from the Atari era. Ew! But still, it got a little bit too ambitious for its own good. The Legend of Zelda is a good game in theory, but in practice, what on earth am I supposed to do? Explore? Yes. But from that point, you likely won't find the hidden bush that holds the final dungeon you need to complete. Metroid practically has the same problem. In theory, the game design formula is amazing, but the game opens up far too quickly and relies on bombing invisible holes in the wall. Bad game. These games have bad game design. It has part to do with limited hardware and part to do with bad game design. Since game design is transcendent of time, I'm still allowed to make fun of these things. If these game design principles were applied today, there would be riots. Even if it was just me, I would riot. There is, however, one game that I think did a very good job. Kirby's Adventure. The only issue I have with it is the lag it often suffers from pushing the limits of the console, but it doesn't ruin the game at all. I would buy this thing in our modern day, if only there were enough affordable, good games on the NES for it to be worth the investment. Yes, I'm pirating it then. I mean, subscribe me to the Nintendo Switch Online subscription service and playing it there! After the NES, we have the SNES and Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive, the SNES's big rival. These games are mostly fine. They're all polished and tailored to the consoles they were made on. I have no real issues. They could easily sell for $20 to $30 nowadays in the context of indie games. And Nintendo sold them for $8 on the SNES Virtual Console. Only they aren't being sold for $8 or $20 or even $30. Retro game peddlers are selling these for no lower than $40 or $50. Unbelievable. Nice try. I'll just go mod my 3DS, subscribing to the Nintendo Switch Online subscription service and playing it there! So if last generation was fine, you'd think that the N64, PlayStation, and Sega Saturn would all be fine too, right? Wrong! These consoles made the jump to 3D graphics, and with a whole new dimension, there's bound to be a lot of jank. For starters, these graphics are no longer polished, and more often than not induce bleeding in my eyeballs. My eyes are the least of my concerns, however, because actually controlling the game is far more frustrating. The games of this generation are plagued by both the console manufacturers and the game developers' ideas for how to use the most important new tool of this generation, that being the camera. Just looking at some of these controllers shows a complete lack of foresight in the minds of the time. Just look at the original PlayStation controller. It doesn't have a single analog stick. The Saturn controller isn't very much better with barely any more buttons than the PlayStation controller, and the N64 controller is ridiculous! You can't even use all of the buttons at the same time! One ROM was designed for 2D games, not that they had any on the N64, and the camera was controlled by 4 buttons. All of these controls result in games with fixed cameras, tank controls, and quite possibly the worst, most imprecise controls in all of gaming. Not to mention that game design in 3D is new and hard, so a ton of returning franchises really struggled this generation. Having to pay $60 or more for the better among these just really doesn't work for me. No thank you. I'll go ahead and just download that emulator. Subscribe to Nintendo Switch right there. A funny fun solution for the retro thorn in my side would be for companies to re-release their games, possibly even remaster or remake them to make them less bad. And that way, companies can stop complaining that people are pirating their games while refusing to do anything about it. Re-releases are annoying to deal with for veteran gamers, I'm sure, but for the preservation of these pieces of art and to make them more accessible to each new generation of gamer, these games should be brought to modern consoles and definitely kept on each new one. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you got something out of it. Please consider subscribing, as it would really mean a lot to me, especially in this early era of my channel.